Today's episode of the podcast is the third of a special 5-part series I recorded interviewing 5 masters of wine. Today's episode features David Ferrer, MW. During our conversation, he tells his origin story and transition from a corporate life to the wine world. He discusses the various challenges and failures that he encountered on the way. We have a broad discussion on snobbery in wine before going in depth into his Spanish winemaking project in Priorat. Enjoy.
My path to the wine trade and my path to the Master of Wine was a long and circuitous one. I always had a passion for wine, and one of my first memories of passion for wine was 17 years old. My brother had come home from university. This was in Canada, where I grew up, in Toronto, and we went out for lunch with my mother to a French bistro, and my brother ordered a bottle of wine, and it came to the middle of the table. This was a country and a city that was a big beer culture and still a liquor culture then. It hadn't gripped onto wine yet. And I was fascinated by the way the mood changed when there was wine at the table. Just people enjoying it. I'm sure it was some white Bordeaux, something fairly cheap at the time, but I was fascinated by the impact that it had. I've always considered wine to be this social beverage, and I always held it in fascination. I loved food. I still love food. I loved wine then. That's where it started from. But I didn't get directly into wine in my career. When I finished university, I spent 20 plus years doing something completely and utterly different. I spent 20 plus years developing drugs for the treatment of cancer. And specifically 2 big drugs, one for ovarian cancer, one for prostate cancer. But it was, I still always had a love for wine, and I always cherished it. I had tasting groups, I had followed the journalism, I followed the journals, and always felt like I wanted to get out of the business I was in and give it a go in wine. And it all came down to a chance meeting of a new neighbor down the street from me in San Francisco. We had, by that point, my wife and I moved to San Francisco, started a family. We were both working in the drug industry. But a chance meeting with my neighbor down the street who had just moved in, Sarah Floyd, is a master sommelier. And we became friends, and I was like, oh my God, you're a master sommelier. This is amazing. I love wine. I want to learn more about it. And as we became friends, I said, how do I get out of my business and get into the wine business? And she said, that's really easy. Quit your job and go work in a retail shop and make $10 an hour. To which I said, I don't think I can do that. 2 kids, tuition, mortgage, that sort of thing. And she says, well, I got an idea, Dave. Go become a master of wine. I said, oh, okay, that's easy. I'll just go do that. Not realizing, of course, how ridiculous that is, and how, now looking back on it, the naivete of saying that. But it did put me on a path of learning more about wine. The prerequisites are the WSET, and so I took level 2 and then level 3, and then I jumped into diploma. And I remember in a level 3 sitting with some students in one of the breaks, and people were asking how they were doing on each bit. And somebody said, hey, is anybody thinking of doing the MW? I said, yeah, me. And they all looked at me like I was crazy. And I was kind of crazy to think that I could do this, especially as an outsider, somebody not working in the trade. And so I applied, and thankfully at the time they were a little bit more lax on outsiders getting into the Master of Wine program. And I got in, and that started, at that point, I'd already been into wine education. It was already 3 years in from this conversation I had with Sarah. And I started down this path of becoming a Master of Wine that was going to take 7+ years to get. But it was an amazing experience to go down that road and to study for the MW. A period of my life filled with unbelievable stress, because you would wake up in the middle of the night and think, have I been studying enough? Did I do enough today? Am I ready to sit the exam? Am I ready to go? And eventually got through it and passed. And there were times of failure. which I think is always humbling. And there were times of success, and those times of success are the most euphoric feelings you can feel in your life.
It's always interesting to me to see how people have come into the industry, I guess, and how they got that first hook. And, if you had not been living next to Sarah, then, who knows where you might be right now. I'd just like to, before we kind of move on to the present and what you're doing now, I'd just invite you to kind of relive some of those challenges that you alluded to there, some of those, more difficult times, and, just sort of flesh them out, I guess now, safe in the knowledge that you overcame them.
I think when people enter the MW program, it's so easy to get daunted by the sheer scale and magnitude of the depth and breadth of what you have to know. And it seems like a mountain that there's no way to climb, even if you come into it with a WSET diploma or even an advanced degree in enology or viticulture or anything like that. It's daunting. It is a huge amount. And I didn't sit the exam the first time I was able to sit it. I delayed. And it was, I never felt the confidence of, should I sit this exam? Should I sit this exam? And finally my wife said, you're sitting this exam this year. You're sitting it. I said, okay, and it gives you a little bit of, spouses always give you that nice extra little push to get it done. And I sat it, and it's 4 days of theory, 3 days of tasting stacked on top of each other. And when I finished, I thought, even if I pass nothing, even if I never pass anything, you can never take away from me the fact that I finished that exam. It's a physically grueling, it's a mentally grueling, it's everything grueling exam that really puts you to your limits. And a long, I think a 12-week wait until the results came out, and I opened up the email, and it showed that I had passed the theory portion of it. Yeah. And I remember walking into my wife, it was early morning, she was having a coffee, and I said, I passed the theory. And she says, oh yeah, okay, that's good. I said, you don't have any reaction? She goes, no, I knew you were going to pass something. I said, you're crazy. I had no thought I was going to pass. And so I felt an elation from that, because then you can also, and it's a path many people take, they pass the theory and then they work on the tasting portion. And what's nice about it is we sort of all came into it because we have an academic desire to learn more about the world of wine. But of course we like drinking it and tasting it. So to focus on the practical portion was a great relief to be able to put the theory behind me. And so I sat it again the next year. Did not pass, and I thought, okay, I've got to figure this out. What are we doing wrong? And a friend of mine who is also studying was in the same place. He was a tasting, what we call practical only. They only had the tasting exam to pass. Said, let's form a tasting group, and we're going to meet every Sunday for 30 weeks straight. And we're going to have a mock exam in the morning. Then we're going to organize a focus tasting in the afternoon, whether it's non-aromatic whites from Europe, whether it's Chardonnays from around the world, or Chardonnay or white Burgundies. And so we met 30 times leading up to the exam. There was a group of us, about 10 on average, that would meet in Napa. And it took my entire Sunday away from my kids. I missed a million soccer practices. It was tough. I still feel like I've missed a portion of my family's life because of it. And then I sat the exam, and I didn't pass. Oh, wow. And I thought, what have I done? And so what happened for me in that situation, and it was, brutally disappointing, what had happened was I was a good taster. I was tasting the wine right, but I wasn't mentally there. There's an expression, if you hear hooves thundering through, don't think zebras, think horses. And I was thinking of zebras. I was, this wine has that. I'm going to change all my answers, and I wasn't trusting myself. So I spent the next year figuring out how to trust my palate and trust myself, and eventually passed the exam, the tasting portion. So now I'm theory down, tasting down. Now I have a research paper to do, but I thought, I spent half of my adult life what I think will be half of my adult life doing research. I've been published in Lancet and a Journal of Clinical Oncology and big, huge journal articles. And I thought, well, I've got this down. Well, it turned out I didn't. I didn't know what the Institute was looking for in a research paper. I didn't structure it the way they were looking for. I had a different understanding of what research was compared to what the Institute. So I didn't pass. I was all ready to go to say I'm a master of wine, and the phone call came, and it was, I'm so sorry, David, your research paper is being referred, and you have to rewrite it and resubmit it and take another 6 months. And that was honestly one of the darkest periods of my life. And so it's easy, and eventually I resubmitted it and I passed. And it's easy to think of all the successes, but the Master of Wine put a lot of disappointments and non-successes and failures, really, honestly, failures. And that was, I think, a great thing about it is because people that go into the Master of Wine program are all pretty elite level folks with solid educations or amazing palates, and they all fail at something. They all struggle. They all have to work hard to get it done. And I think it was great for me to feel that kind of failure. Of course, it didn't feel good at the time, but I think now it's good because it gives some is the word hubris, I think. And it was great for my kids who were then just entering their teenage years to see their father fail. And I, in a weird way, I'm sort of glad I failed at some of these things because it brought me to a place and it forced me to push my knowledge for wine. It pushed me to improve my palate, the way I taste wine. But of course, there is no greater elation than the phone call that says, David Forer, congratulations, you are a master of wine. It is the single greatest emotion you could ever feel.
And thank you for being so honest. I think it's something that we don't often see, I think, enough of and hear enough of failure. And I believe that if somebody who's listening either is thinking about becoming an MW or is already embarked on the path to becoming an MW, failure may well be on the horizon, or they may already have experienced that. So I'm really happy that you've shared that and delved into that because I can empathize with that. I failed at lots of things. I'm sure other people have. So yeah, thanks for sharing. So pretty much, yeah. I mean, bring us up to date, and I've asked you really today just to talk about and share what's front of mind. So yeah, over to you.
I became an MW a couple years ago, and at that time we saw an opportunity with my family to be able to move, and we thought, well, for entering the wine industry full time, what better place in the old world? And we picked up sticks from San Francisco, and we moved to Barcelona and settled in. And I had an opportunity to take a breath and think, okay, where do I want to be involved in the world of wine? And for me, it comes back to that first experience with my brother and my mother in this French bistro, drinking this likely not very expensive wine, enjoying this social consumption and conviviality of the table, as I call it, the table, with wine at it. And I thought, I want to be involved in wine as a pleasurable beverage, where, sure, we all like to drink super expensive, fancy wines, but we need to understand that the wine business and wine consumption and wine consumers drink wines from all sorts of spectrums of styles and qualities and price points. And one of the things I loved about the Master of Wine is that it's not the Master of Fine Wine. We regularly have on the exam White Zinfandel from Central Valley, California. Something that would sell for, 4 or 5 pounds here in the UK. And that would be right next to a Grand Cru Chardonnay from a white Burgundy. That would be right next to a Grand Cru white Burgundy. Because we need to understand these are both important wines to the world of wine. And we should not be making fun of consumers because they want to drink something sweet, or they want to drink something cheap, or they want to drink something that they're used to. We should be encouraging that. And my passion is about the pleasure of wine. So, for instance, I moved to the old world where there is, for example, a lot of natural wine natural wine bars. I was just at a famous one last night in Barcelona called Bar Brutal. And I moved to Europe and thought, I'm going to try as much natural wine as I can and see if I can understand it and see if I can understand where this fits into the world. And here's my problem with natural wine. I don't have a problem with organics, biodynamics, minimal intervention. In fact, I support all of that. But what I have a problem with is pleasure police. I want wine to taste good. I want it to taste delicious. I do not want wine to taste interesting. If you have a push for a class of wine or category of wine that pushes on interesting rather than delicious, you are not paying attention to the regular consumer's desire for having a nice, tasty beverage in a social setting. You're pushing your mores on consumers. Hey, listen, if you can make a wine with fantastic work in the vineyard, taking care of the relationship between the vineyard and our planet, and you can do it with a minimal amount of intervention, even I'll push it so far as to say with no SO2, if you can make that delicious, I love you. But too often, wines that are pushed in that direction, especially with regards to SO2, are not delicious and they're not pleasurable. So I have turned this into a little bit of my position on natural wine, but it sort of fits in with my desire for people to enjoy wine and enjoy all sorts of different styles of wine and wine from different places and different price points, respecting the consumer and having a good time. Really deep down, I'm a hedonist, and I like to have a good time, and I like to drink tasty, delicious wine. I don't need somebody coming along and saying, you need to not drink that because that's not whatever reason they give. You need to taste this. This is really interesting. I think the added problem I have is because I've trained my palate for so many different styles of wine to be able to pass the Master of Wine, I understand when something is interesting or when something is flawed. And most of the time when people say this natural wine is interesting, it's flawed.
I think that the term delicious is a really interesting one for me. It's one that I see sommeliers using a lot. It's one that I see people just using in the trade, and to me it doesn't feel lazy either. It just feels like it's truthful. It's at the end of the day, you can use, there's books, there's so much written about wine, so many words, and so many sort of floral descriptions, but delicious just feels like the truth. It feels like that is what all of those words, in a sense, kind of all come down to. And I'm actually not so much to push back, but I'm wondering if maybe through my experiences and what I've seen and the kind of the fairs that I go to and the people that I'm around, I wonder if actually the world of, and this is an impossible thing to define, of course, but let's say natural wine drinkers, and maybe even having been at Raw last week, people who are at Raw, my perception of that world, again, this big globus term, is that people are becoming less and less tolerant of the fault, and actually they are experiencing a shift towards seeking the delicious. And that actually the wines that maybe they were labelled as interesting and maybe there was a little bit of Emperor's New Clothes about them, as this is what you should be drinking, this is kind of where it is. My gut feel, honestly, with zero facts to back it up, just my palate and the people that I've around and the wines I'm tasting, the conversations I'm hearing, is that actually people are already shifting in that direction, and that they are becoming less tolerant of faulty winemaking. And that's my experience. And I just wonder, are you seeing that already, or do you think we still have some way to go?
Yes, I think there is a movement towards, in the natural wine community, of having wines with fewer faults. The problem I have is without SO2, it's very difficult to make wines that have a good probability of ending up at that final consumer without faults. I was tasting in the Jura last summer with Stéphane Tissot. Wines are incredible, beautiful wines, but they're fragile. And I've had them after being shipped overseas, and you sort of go, oof, they've lost that verve, they've lost that life. I think many times, especially here in Europe, you can taste a wine as it's come very quickly from the winery. And yes, it might have no SO2, but it hasn't been damaged yet. But it's just a matter of time before it oxidizes too fast or it gets an infection. I hope they continue pushing towards delicious, because in the end, that's really what we all want. I want to be clear, though, of my opinion before I start getting hate mail from people over me attacking natural. I think organic is essential viticultural practice to help our planet. There are even instances where organic is not enough. You could go to Castilla-La Mancha in Spain and see organic that you sort of go, well, this isn't what I thought of as organic. I'm also becoming a proponent of biodynamics. Well, I bought a vineyard in the Priorat last summer, and we are investigating biodynamics and using some of those principles and trying to bring life back to the soil and biodiversity. I get it. I think being respectful of the land brings out the best in your grapes, which brings out the best in your wine. I also think in the Priorat, where we've had a history of a lot of new oak, we're not using new oak. We're trying to understand how they used to make wine with these the indigenous varieties that we have in our vineyard. So I get it. The problem I have is the flavor police, the pleasure police. I want wine to still be enjoyable, and I think too much of the natural community is about interesting. I never want to drink an interesting wine again in my life because I've been ruined for it. I want delicious. But I also want to stay the other side. There is a ton of manufactured wine, and I don't like that either. I lived in California for 20 plus years, and because of my desire to understand more about consumer behavior at the lower end, I tasted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cheap supermarket wines from California, and that's not good either. I've gotten to the point where I can taste when they've added tannins. I can see when they've added super mega purple. I can see when they've acidified. I get it, and I don't like that either. But there has to be some understanding that people are drinking those, they find pleasure in them, and we can't be disrespectful of a person's pleasure. Now, we can take those consumers and say, okay, yeah, that's a manufactured wine. Here's a nice fruity red wine from here that's still vinous and still is real wine instead of the manufactured stuff. I agree we need to push in that direction. But so that is to say, I don't like one end and I don't like the other either. And my desire based on having wine that is delicious is where I'm living right now.
And I think really just to kind of close off this discussion, because I like we seem to be thinking in the same sort of way in terms of a sort of a continuum, a spectrum. It feels like there's something missing though from this particular spectrum, and for me it feels like you haven't really touched on fine wine. And I'm just curious. I'll kind of put it out there. Do similar things happen in terms of is there a different sort of pleasure police in the fine wine community? Are there wines that are put out there that people are expected to like, and maybe they're not allowed to express their displeasure, or just the fact that it's not moving them as another wine, maybe a cheaper wine, maybe a more inferior wine might move them?
I think the fine wine world also has its share of problems in terms of policing. I think, sure, when I get a really well-stored, good example of a Burgundy that's been aged properly, I find immense joy in it. The problem is that people end up thinking there's only certain directions you can go with fine wine. And we all end up in the same places. Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, Rhone, wherever it is. And generally, those places are in the old world. And we think, the only fine wine can be in the old world. And I'm sorry, we have to open up our eyes to some of the amazing wine that is made in the New World. And I'm talking fine wine. You look at something like in California, you have Ridge Montebello. This is a wine that blows all experts away since 1976 from the Judgment of Paris. You take, I just came back from a master wine trip to New Zealand and was in Central Otago, and there are producers there, this is speaking of natural again, who are pushing biodynamics and pushing respect for the land and are pushing quality and complexity and terroir-driven wines. Those wines are more terroir-driven than so many regions in the old world. And we can't fail to acknowledge this. If you taste some of the amazing examples of Chardonnay from Australia, or you taste some of the Swartland, cool, they might be trendy, but Swartland Reds from South Africa, or I was in South Africa a couple years ago and tasted some of the top sparkling wines made in the traditional method, and they're stunning. There's a snobbery level within the fine wine world, too, that, it's not so much a pleasure police as it is just a police or a regional police that, you're drinking something from the New World. Oh, you can't drink that. I'm sorry. There's a lot of manufactured wines in the Old World, too. There's a lot of wine regions, premium regions, that don't really have terroir, and they speak about terroir. For instance, look at Bordeaux. You can be a top growth, and you have your land, and you could buy a 3 levels down growth, and all of a sudden now that's, instead of 5th growth, it's now 2nd growth. Really? And where's the terroir in this? Now they will say that they separate it and they put it in different lots and they'll do it in different tiers or whatever. Come on, please. Look at Champagne. Trust me. Well, before I get attacked by Champagne people, I love sparkling wine from around the world, and I'm sorry, Champagne is the greatest sparkling wine in the world. But you want to talk terroir? You've got land that's had pesticides and herbicides dumped on it for the last 50 plus years, obliterating, in my opinion, sense of terroir, followed up with a winemaking that also serves to take out terroir. Now, I'm going on a trip to Champagne, a 5-day extensive trip in 2 weeks. My goal on that trip is to see if there's terroir. But I'm not convinced there is. I'm sorry, but you go to Tasmania, there's terroir in those wines. So, in answer to your question, there is police in the fine wine world too. And really, shut up and let people enjoy what they're drinking. You know, you don't have to go over it. Oh, you're only drinking that. Oh, that's too bad. That's just an AC level Burgundy. Oh, come on. Let people enjoy what they're drinking and what they can afford, and don't be such a snob. The wine world has enough snobs as it is. We don't need to contribute to this anymore. Let people enjoy what they're drinking. Here's my dirty little secret, and all my friends in California will know. I love Muscat. A nice, fruity, fresh Muscat. Think of a Moscato d'Asti on a terrace in the summertime. It just tastes delicious and lovely. Is it fine wine? I don't know. I don't care. I enjoy it, and it's lovely, and it's delicious. Don't look down your nose at me. Here's another example. If I'm having a glass of rosé on a terrace, and it's, or even if it's a red wine somewhere, if it's not the right temperature, you know what I do? I throw an ice cube in it. I stir it around for a few seconds. I take the ice cube out. Why? Because I get better pleasure with a wine that's diluted 3%, which I'm sorry to say you cannot taste, and I've done the actual sensory analysis. You cannot taste the difference in a 5% diluted wine. But I get it at the right temperature, and the sensual enjoyment is better. Don't look down your nose at me because I put an ice cube in my red wine. Or my rosé, or even if I leave it in my rosé, leave me alone. So yes, there are pleasure police. I must say it's one of the privileges of being a master of wine is now I don't care. You can look down your nose at me. I say I'm going to drink whatever I want. I'm going to enjoy whatever I want, and I'm going to take pleasure in not insulting other people's preferences, not insulting their knowledge, not insulting their anxieties. People are anxious about wine. We need to stop enhancing that anxiety and just start enhancing their enjoyment of wine. I think in the end, one of the mantras I have for anybody that's studying about wine, anybody that likes wine, anybody that wants to taste more about wine, just remember, in the end, it's just wine. Get the pleasure you want out of it. Get the pleasure out of the knowledge you want, or out of the tasting you're doing, or the drinking that you're doing. Do it with humility, and remember, it's just wine.
I would just personally like to thank you for talking in that way. I just think it's not something that's put out there enough, just in terms of it is a drink, and people are entitled to drink whatever they want, whatever they can afford, whatever they're in the mood for. But then also, as well, I think there is a place for those, 4 or 5 pound wines, that maybe are not fine wines, are not natural, and are not sort of organic, but they can be a window to people. They can get people away from drinking other things. They can bring them closer to the wine world, and it might be one of those 5 pound wines that people may look down their nose at, that opens the door to somebody who goes on to be a master sommelier or an MW or a writer or anything in the wine trade. It may just be that wine that opens it up for them. So if they're sensing those sort of disapproving looks and sideward glares, then they may not pick up that first glass that actually opens up the door for them. So I do think that's really important to say. And then I'd also then like to really give you a chance to talk about your wine project. As listeners will know, I've got a very strong association with Spain. Used to live in Madrid, and that's actually where the podcast started. So I'm just super excited to hear about what you've got going on over in Priorat.
When I moved to Spain, I started exploring different wine regions and realized that there was such a depth of sophistication of wine in Spain, sophistication that rarely gets exported. And it went through decades of quality improvement at all through all sorts of levels of the wine. But there's a newfound sophistication of people going back and finding indigenous varieties, going back to their family vineyard and trying to improve quality and make wines of place, wines of substance. And in my travels, I went through to the Priorat, which is just a couple hours drive from Barcelona. And from the first moment we crested the hill and saw the region, I thought, where are we? This place is amazing. This is a region that had 20,000 hectares of vines before phylloxera, and now has 2,000, I think, is the rough numbers. When you drive through, you see, it's not monoculture. You see vineyards, and then you see biodiversity and wild space. But in that wild space, often up the hills, often on the steeper parts, you see old terraces that were built with stone by people that realize, we've got to build a wall, get some dirt behind it, and plant something so that we can survive. So we'll plant anything that'll grow there. And I fell in love with this idea of there's no such thing as soil in Priorat. It's just rocks. It's almost like going through Châteauneuf-du-Pape, where you're walking on just like a riverbed of stones. And the opportunity to think of, I could make a wine, really a wine of terroir here. And so circumstances led to me meeting a local wine producer named Frank Massard. He was a UK best sommelier years ago. Frenchman who lives in Barcelona. He was producing wine from purchased grapes, and he wanted to simplifying the story, buy a vineyard. And we went in on it together and bought this 10-hectare property in Priorat in the town of Poboleda. We're in it to make a true wine of place, a vin de terroir. Those words are some of the greatest bullshit in the wine business. People say, we're making a vin de terroir, and then throwing, 30 months of new French oak at it, or, using only clones, or doing this real homogenization and just obliterating any kind of terroir. But there are people that are trying to make vin de terroir, and it was only when we got into it did I realize, what does that mean? I was a master of wine, and I thought, I know something about wine. And then I bought a vineyard and realized, I don't know anything about wine. I've got to really try and figure this out. And one of the key questions is, what is a wine of place? What is a vin de terroir? What does that mean? So we're working at it. We're trying to figure out how to get the grapes that are harvested from that vineyard to express where they're grown the best way they can. Now, we were lucky the vineyard we purchased had fairly old vines. For the Priorat, 20 years old is not very old. It only really gets old at 50, 60, 70. That's when the people say that it has some good sense of place. But we have some centenarian, 100-year-old vines, but most of it's 20 to 30 years old. And so we're lucky in that respect. We were lucky that the previous owner had farmed organically and really cared for the land. We're lucky that there's biodiversity around. And so we thought, okay, we've got to try and figure out get those grapes to represent the land. How do you do that? And so we're looking at things like enhancing biodiversity, bees, bats, owls, wildlife, insects. We are bringing back native vegetation as opposed to some of the stuff that's invasive, pulling that out and working with the biodiversity specialists to do that. Will that bring out the terroir in the wine? Well, we're hoping a little bit. And now we're looking at biodynamics. Is that a way to get the soil to be healthy, to get the microbial activity in the soil to be healthy and in balance? I attended an amazing lecture from Laura Catena from Argentina last summer, where she talked about the definition of terroir needing to be expanded to include microbes in the soil. That's part of the definition of terroir, and I'm starting to understand what she meant. And she's doing a lot of work on that in Argentina. We went to visit the Adriana vineyard, and she's doing amazing work on that in a purely scientific way to try and understand what microbes in the soil do. And there's a lot of scientific evidence that if you want a vine to be in balance, if you want a vine to express the terroir, you need microbial activity. So we're working at exploring biodynamics, and it's a process. As you don't just buy a vineyard and go, okay, we made a vin de terroir. We are trying to learn, and the tough thing about wine is you get one chance a year. So it's not like you can oh wow, that kind of pruning method didn't work so well to help us get balance and that sort of thing. So it's an exciting process. And we're enjoying every minute of it.
Yes. I mean, super fascinating. I mean, I could ask lots and lots of questions about that, but let's give you one last question, and let's kind of, I guess, try and tie a few things together, and ask you to sort of look forward, really. I guess in a sense of what is your role, and, what is your kind of day job going to look like going forward, tying together what you're doing in the vineyard, what you may have coming out of the production line, along with any other work that you're, I'm sure, getting asked to get involved with.
I'm a pleasure police from a hedonistic perspective. I mentioned that already, but I'm also have a passion about communication and how I came into the wine business from a different industry, so I viewed it as somebody that hadn't been entrenched in it for 20 years. I also came at it from a perspective of living in the Silicon Valley area and influenced by that innovation and desire for examining and change and seeing if there's a way to do something differently. The wine industry is entrenched with historical norm communication. The producer talks to the export manager, who talks to the importer, that talks to the distributor, that talks to the retailers, who talks to the consumer, or the on-premise that talks to the diner. And the wine people produce wine because they have a passion for it, and they have a message that they want to give that is about their passion, and it gets lost in the chain. And so I am passionate about getting the message from the producer to the consumer in the most unadulterated and passionful way. Just this week was pictures and pictures and pictures on social media from Provine, and this is, I think, a trouble spot where you have these halls and halls and halls filled with thousands of both sides, buyers and sellers, who are, of course, having a great time, but this is the normal way that everybody's been doing it for so long. And the message gets lost, and the branding, the way that you communicate your brand message to the consumer gets lost in all this big kerfuffle. And why should there really be only one way of distributing your wine? Why only one way of getting your wine to the consumer through this chain? Isn't there some other way of doing it? So my desire for my future is to investigate, is there some way that we can, to bring in a Silicon Valley term, disrupt the distribution chain of wine? Is there a way of disrupting the communication of wine from producer to consumer? Can we do it better? Can we do it in a way that brings that passion from the producer to the consumer? So, for example, I want to do this with my own wines. I want to see if there's a way that I can bring my passion to the consumer, not through the normal distribution channels. But I partially moved to Europe. I moved to the old world because I saw there was opportunity to improve the communication and the distribution for these companies. You know, and as I've talked to many producers in Spain, I say, why do you have that label, which I would say is not a good label, say, for instance. They say, well, that was because that's the label we've always had. And we've changed it a little bit, and I see tweaks, and I think this is still a crappy label. Okay, why do you do your viticulture, or why do you do your winemaking that way? Oh, well, that's because my father did and my grandfather before him. It was always men. Now we're thankfully seeing some changes to that. And then I say, why do you use that importer to get into that market? Or why do you just focus on that market? Oh, because that's the way we've always done it. And there's so much opportunity to re-examine the way you're doing things. I would love to bring some of that innovative spirit to the old world. I would like to see, not just in my own wines, but in other people's wines or wine regions, bring some innovation in the way that you communicate and the way you get your path to market for wines. Now, to be fair, it's proven a little bit difficult in Spain because people just don't want to change. And so I want to look at other regions and look at producers that do want to change and do want to try to improve their sales, improve their distribution, but most importantly, improve the way that they communicate their passion, because they have passion for making wine, the way they communicate their passion to the final consumer.
Thank you so much to David. It was a real pleasure to meet you. I really feel like you gave an honest perspective on what it takes to become an MW. Do feel free to get in touch with David. I've included his contact details below. Also, if you're not already subscribed wherever you're listening, then do please subscribe right away. And of course, if you're not already, you can follow along with me on Instagram and Facebook, where I'm at Interpreting Wine. On Twitter, where I'm at Wine Podcast. Or email hello@interpretingwine.com. We're now past the halfway point in this special 5-part MW interview series. And we really pick up the energy again next time in episode 253, when I sit down with Mick O'Connell, MW. See you then.